The dining room of the Calder estate was a cathedral of opulence. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm glow, refracting light onto the gold-accented tableware and mahogany surfaces. Eleanor Calder, the wife of self-made millionaire Adrian Calder, was the very embodiment of icy elegance, perched at the head of the table like a queen surveying her court. A sharp clang shattered the hum of murmured conversation. A crystal goblet tipped over, its contents spilling across the pristine linen. "How clumsy!" Eleanor hissed, her voice laced with venom. She fixed her icy blue eyes on Marta, the cleaner standing nearby, who had inadvertently bumped the table while dusting. "This is why people like you shouldn't even be in the presence of those who actually matter." The room froze. Adrian, seated at the other end, glanced at his wife with a mix of irritation and resignation but said nothing. Their guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, unsure whether to intervene or pretend the scene wasn't happening. Marta, who had been working at the Calder estate for years, clenched her fists to steady herself. Her caramel-colored eyes betrayed a flicker of defiance that she quickly masked. She bent down, her movements slow and deliberate, to mop up the spill. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "Maybe you should wear gloves next time," she sneered, her voice rising. "Wouldn't want your filthy hands contaminating our glassware." Marta rose silently, clutching the soaked rag. Her gaze locked on Eleanor's, defiant for a brief moment before she dropped it, her face impassive. She turned to leave, but before she could exit, Eleanor's voice followed her like a whip. "You'll stay. I'll deal with you after dinner." Adrian's fork clattered onto his plate. "Enough, Eleanor," he said curtly, his tone low but firm. Eleanor shot him a glance, her lips curling in contempt. "You spoil the help too much, Adrian. That's why they think they can behave like this." Marta slipped out of the room, her cheeks burning, but not with shame, with rage. Her thoughts churned as she made her way to the service wing of the house. It wasn't the first time Eleanor had humiliated her, but this time felt different. The stakes were higher. Marta wasn't just a cleaner anymore. She was the keeper of secrets, ones that could bring the Calder empire crashing down. Marta's heart raced as she entered the modest quarters reserved for the staff. She locked the door behind her and sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she retrieved a small, leather-bound notebook from her apron pocket. Inside were notes she had carefully compiled over the past year. Financial records, mysterious late-night phone calls, and, most damning of all, evidence of Eleanor's dealings with a shadowy figure known only as Mr. Black. It had all started 6 months ago when Marta overheard a heated argument between Eleanor and Adrian. She had been cleaning the library late at night when Eleanor's voice, sharp and cutting, sliced through the thick oak doors. "If you don't fix this, Adrian, we'll lose everything. I'm not going back to living like some nobody." Adrian's reply had been calmer but no less biting. "If you hadn't insisted on those investments, Eleanor, we wouldn't be in this mess. And don't think I don't know about your arrangement with Mr. Black." Curiosity and a simmering resentment toward her employers had driven Marta to dig deeper. She had no idea at the time how dark the trail would become. Now, as she leafed through the notebook, her jaw tightened. She had enough information to destroy them, but what good was the truth if she didn't have the power to wield it? A soft knock at the door startled her. She quickly slipped the notebook back into her pocket and opened the door to find Felix, the young chauffeur, standing there. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing down the empty hallway. Felix ignored her warning, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. His dark eyes burned with urgency. "I heard what happened at dinner," he said. "You can't let her get away with it this time." Marta shook her head. "What can I do? She owns me." Felix smirked. "Maybe, but Adrian, he owes you. Don't forget that." The mention of Adrian stirred something in Marta. He did owe her, more than he probably even realized. But did she have the courage to confront him? The following morning, Marta was summoned to Eleanor's private sitting room. She entered cautiously, half expecting to be fired on the spot. Instead, she found Eleanor seated on a velvet chaise, a glass of champagne in hand. "Ah, there you are," Eleanor said, her tone almost pleasant. "I've decided to give you a second chance, Marta. Consider it an act of mercy." Marta blinked, confused. Mercy wasn't in Eleanor Calder's vocabulary. Eleanor continued, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "In fact, I'd like you to join us for the charity gala tomorrow evening." The words hung in the air like a cruel joke. Marta opened her mouth to protest but thought better of it. This was no invitation. It was a trap. Eleanor was setting her up for public humiliation, and the woman's expression said as much. "Thank you, Mrs. Calder," Marta said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'll be there." As she left the room, Marta's mind raced. Eleanor had just handed her the perfect opportunity, an audience of Savannah's most powerful figures. She didn't have to expose the Calder family in private. She could do it where it would hurt them the most, in front of their peers. For the first time in months, Marta felt the spark of hope. If she played her cards right, tomorrow wouldn't just be another night of servitude. It would be the night she took back control. Marta's reflection stared back at her from the cracked mirror in her small room. She smoothed down the satin gown Eleanor had sent for her to wear, a deep emerald green that felt like both a gift and a curse. It fit perfectly, an unsettling reminder of how well Eleanor could play the part of benevolent mistress when it served her. But Marta wasn't a pawn. Not anymore. She reached for the leather-bound notebook tucked away in the hidden compartment of her dresser. Tonight, this little book held the power to rewrite everything. A wave of doubt threatened to paralyze her, but she forced it down. She couldn't afford fear tonight. The Calder estate sparkled like a crown jewel, its sprawling gardens illuminated by strings of fairy lights. Luxury cars pulled into the circular driveway, depositing Savannah's elite onto the red carpet leading into the grand ballroom. Inside, the opulence was almost blinding. Gilded chandeliers, flowing champagne, and orchestral music that felt as decadent as the surroundings. Marta entered through the main doors for the first time, not through the servants' entrance. The guests parted as she walked in, their murmurs swirling around her like smoke. For a moment, she felt the weight of their judgment. How dare a cleaner walk among them, dressed like one of them? Adrian Calder was the first to notice her. His dark eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly masked it with his usual neutral expression. Eleanor, however, didn't bother to hide her reaction. Her lips twitched into a smirk, her sharp gaze raking over Marta like she was appraising a painting. "Marta," Eleanor cooed, stepping forward to greet her. "How lovely you look. That gown. It's almost as if it was made for you." "Thank you, Mrs. Calder," Marta replied, her voice even. She forced a polite smile, knowing she was being baited. Eleanor leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Enjoy yourself," she said sweetly, but her eyes gleamed with malice. "And remember, you're only here because I allowed it." Marta didn't respond. She didn't need to. Tonight, her actions would speak louder than words. The first hour passed in a blur of polite conversation and empty smiles. Marta moved through the room with calculated grace, careful not to let her nerves show. She kept her distance from Eleanor but stayed within sight of Adrian, waiting for the right moment. As she sipped her champagne, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Impressive," Felix said, appearing at her side. He looked unrecognizably sharp in a tailored suit, his usual scruffy demeanor replaced with quiet confidence. "What are you doing here?" Marta asked, her surprise genuine. Felix grinned. "Let's just say chauffeurs pick up more than passengers. I figured you might need a friend tonight." Marta didn't have time to argue. She was glad to see him, even if his presence added a layer of risk. "Stay close," she said, "but don't draw attention to yourself." Felix tilted his head, his expression serious now. "Marta, are you sure about this? Going up against Eleanor Calder isn't just bold. It's dangerous." Marta glanced across the room, where Eleanor was holding court with a circle of Savannah's most influential socialites, the very picture of charm and elegance. But Marta knew the truth beneath the mask. "Dangerous," Marta repeated, her voice firm, but necessary. As the night wore on, Marta watched for her opportunity. It came during a lull in the festivities when the orchestra paused for a brief intermission. The room quieted, and Adrian Calder took the opportunity to step onto the small stage at the far end of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Adrian began, his deep voice commanding the room. "Thank you for joining us tonight. Your generosity will go a long way toward the causes we hold dear." The crowd clapped politely. Adrian's words were well rehearsed, but his expression seemed distracted, his eyes flickering toward Eleanor. Marta knew what that meant. She had read the financial reports tucked away in the notebook. Adrian was barely keeping the Calder fortune afloat, and Eleanor's secret dealings were the only reason the estate hadn't already crumbled. But at what cost? As Adrian stepped down, Eleanor seized the moment, gliding onto the stage with her practiced grace. "And now," she announced, her voice dripping with charm, "a toast to the man who has built all of this, my wonderful husband." The room applauded again, but Marta didn't join in. Instead, she moved toward the stage, her steps purposeful. Felix followed at a distance, his expression wary. Eleanor caught sight of her as she raised her glass. Her smile faltered for the briefest moment, replaced by something colder. But she recovered quickly, locking eyes with Marta as if daring her to act. Marta didn't hesitate. She reached the edge of the stage, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. "Mrs. Calder," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "Before you finish that toast, I believe the guests deserve to hear the truth." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's glass froze mid-air, her knuckles tightening around the stem. Adrian turned sharply, his confusion mirrored by the guests. "Marta," Eleanor said, her tone dangerously low, "this isn't the time for theatrics." "Oh, I agree," Marta replied, pulling the notebook from her clutch. "But it is the perfect time for honesty." The room fell into stunned silence. Marta's hand trembled slightly as she held up the notebook, but her voice was steady. "This notebook contains records, financial documents, correspondence, proving that Mrs. Calder has been funding illegal operations to cover the Calder family's debts. Mr. Calder," she turned to Adrian, her gaze piercing, "your wife has been lying to you, to all of you." Adrian's face turned ashen. Eleanor's mask of composure cracked, fury blazing in her eyes. But before she could speak, Marta held up a hand. "And I'm not done," she continued. "Those dealings have endangered not only this family's fortune but also countless lives." The room erupted into chaos. Gasps, murmurs, and the scrape of chairs as some guests rose in shock. Felix stepped closer to Marta, his posture protective. Eleanor, however, remained frozen, her face a portrait of rage and disbelief. "Marta," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is this true?" Marta met his gaze, her expression softening for a moment. "I didn't want to do this, Mr. Calder, but your wife gave me no choice." Eleanor's voice finally broke through, sharp and venomous. "You insolent little—" "Enough!" Adrian's voice boomed, silencing the room. His gaze shifted between Marta and Eleanor, realization dawning in his eyes. "Adrian," Eleanor began, her voice softening, but the damage was done. As the orchestra resumed, the echoes of Marta's revelation hung in the air. What would come next was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Calder Empire would never be the same. The grandeur of the Calder estate, once a fortress of wealth and prestige, now felt hollow and brittle as whispers of Marta's revelation reverberated through the ballroom. The chandelier above cast fragmented reflections onto the marble floor, mirroring the fracturing image of the Calder family. Adrian, pale and visibly shaken, looked at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. "Adrian, don't listen to her," Eleanor said, her voice thick with desperation. She took a step toward him, her manicured fingers outstretched. "She's lying. This is all a scheme." Adrian didn't move. His gaze shifted from Eleanor to Marta, then to the notebook still clutched in Marta's trembling hand. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice soft but edged with steel. "Have you been hiding things from me, Eleanor?" Eleanor's face twitched, her composure slipping for the first time in years. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by Adrian, who had always deferred to her when it came to the family's social standing. "I did what I had to," she snapped, her voice breaking. "For us, for this family. Do you think your integrity pays the bills?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as the guests leaned in, their champagne glasses forgotten. Marta stepped back, her heart pounding as she watched the drama unfold. She hadn't anticipated it would unravel so quickly. She expected Eleanor to deny everything, to spin her web of lies as usual. Instead, she was watching the woman unravel in real time. Adrian's jaw tightened, and his voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "You've been laundering money through Black Enterprises, haven't you?" The mention of the name sent a visible shudder through Eleanor. Her silence was answer enough. Adrian turned to Marta. "How do you know all of this?" Marta hesitated, acutely aware of the eyes of Savannah's elite on her. She had worked so hard to remain invisible in this world, and now she was standing at its center. But there was no turning back. "Months ago, I overheard Mrs. Calder speaking to someone," Marta said, her voice steady. "It wasn't hard to piece things together. The ledger pages in this notebook came from your library, Mr. Calder. I didn't want to expose this, but she forced my hand." "Forced your hand?" Eleanor spat, her composure now fully shattered. "You're a cleaner. You don't belong here, and you certainly don't get to lecture me about—" "Eleanor!" Adrian barked, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Enough!" Eleanor froze, her face ashen. She opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. Adrian turned to Marta, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Marta hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because I wasn't sure you'd listen," she said finally. "People like me, we're easy to ignore." The honesty in her voice struck something deep within Adrian. He glanced around the room, suddenly aware of the sea of judgmental eyes fixed on them. "This isn't the place for this," Adrian said quietly, his tone resolute. "We'll discuss this in private." But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The guests in the room began to murmur louder, and a few even took out their phones, discreetly snapping photos or recording snippets of the exchange. Eleanor, sensing her world crumbling, straightened her shoulders and forced a brittle smile onto her face. "This is ridiculous," she said, addressing the crowd. "A disgruntled maid and some old paperwork? That's hardly proof of anything." Marta's jaw tightened. "You're right," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through Eleanor's deflections. "The proof isn't just in this notebook. It's in the offshore accounts, the ones Mr. Black set up for you." Eleanor's eyes widened, and for the first time, Marta saw genuine fear flash across her face. "You think you're so untouchable," Marta continued, her voice rising, "but you've been sloppy. People notice when money moves in and out of accounts that shouldn't even exist." "Marta," Adrian interrupted, his voice commanding but not unkind. "That's enough." The room fell silent. Marta's breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of her actions caught up to her. She had just declared war on the most powerful woman in Savannah, and there was no retreat. Adrian stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low but deadly. "If what Marta says is true, I need to know. Now." Eleanor's hands balled into fists at her sides. For a moment, Marta thought she might lash out, but instead, Eleanor smiled. A cold, dangerous smile. "You want to know the truth, Adrian?" Eleanor said, her voice trembling with rage. "Fine. Yes, I worked with Mr. Black. Yes, I moved money. But I did it for you. For us. You're the one who wanted to hold on to this estate, to your reputation. Do you think I enjoyed crawling to Black, begging for help? Do you think I wanted to risk everything?" Adrian recoiled as if he'd been struck. "You dragged our name through the mud. You've jeopardized everything we've built. And you expect me to believe you did it for us? I did it because you're weak, Eleanor snapped. The venom in her voice stunned the room into silence. You've always been too proud to make the hard choices. Someone had to do it. Adrian's face darkened. For the first time that evening, he looked every inch the powerful man who had built an empire from nothing. You've betrayed me, Eleanor, he said softly. And for that, there will be consequences. As Adrian turned to address the guests, Eleanor staggered backward, her face pale. The crowd was still frozen, the weight of the drama holding them captive. Ladies and gentlemen, Adrian said, his voice heavy with authority. Thank you for your generosity tonight, but as you can see, we have personal matters to address. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. I'll have my staff see you out. It was a dismissal, plain and simple. The guests began to murmur, some moving toward the exits, others lingering to watch the fallout. Marta stayed rooted to the spot as Eleanor shot her a look of pure hatred. You think you've won, Eleanor hissed as she passed Marta. But you have no idea what you've unleashed. Marta didn't respond. She simply watched as Eleanor stormed out of the ballroom, leaving Adrian standing alone on the stage. Felix appeared at Marta's side, his expression unreadable. That was brave, he said quietly. But it's not over. Marta nodded, her fingers brushing the notebook in her hand. She had struck the first blow, but the war for the Calder Empire was far from finished. The morning after the gala dawned quiet but heavy, the kind of silence that hinted at storms brewing just beneath the surface. The Calder estate seemed unnaturally subdued, as though the walls themselves were reeling from the events of the previous night. Marta awoke early, her body tense, her mind replaying the moments of the gala in vivid detail. The leather-bound notebook sat on the nightstand beside her, a quiet testament to her courage or recklessness. She wasn't sure which anymore. Felix knocked softly on her door and entered before she could answer, his expression grim. You stirred up a hornet's nest, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Marta gave a bitter laugh. What did I expect? That she'd thank me for exposing her? Felix crossed the room and pulled a newspaper from under his arm, unfolding it with a flourish. The front page headline read, Calder Empire on the Brink? Shocking Revelations at Charity Gala. Marta's stomach dropped as she skimmed the article. It was worse than she had imagined. The piece detailed Eleanor's alleged financial improprieties, Adrian's visible shock, and Marta's role in the night's drama. Though her name wasn't mentioned, the description of a bold whistleblower from the Calder staff left little doubt. This is going to make life interesting, Felix said, his tone light but his eyes serious. I didn't do this for attention, Marta said, her voice tight. I just wanted the truth to come out. Felix sat beside her, his expression softening. The truth's a messy thing, Marta. It doesn't set you free. It throws you into the fire. Later that morning, Marta was summoned to Adrian's private study. She entered cautiously, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The study was a place of quiet power, its walls lined with shelves of leather-bound books and the air heavy with the scent of cedar and old paper. Adrian stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the sunlight streaming in. When he turned, his face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp. Marta, he began, his voice steady but cold. Do you understand what you've done? Marta straightened her shoulders. I did what I had to, Eleanor. I'm not here to defend her, Adrian interrupted. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've already contacted my lawyers. The accounts she used are being frozen, and I've initiated an internal audit. But this public spectacle has complicated everything. Marta felt a pang of guilt but forced herself to stay resolute. The public has a right to know. This isn't just about your family. It's about the people she's hurt. Adrian's gaze darkened. You think you're the hero here? You've dragged my family's name through the mud. Eleanor dragged your name through the mud. Marta shot back. I just shined a light on it. Adrian studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. You're right, but that doesn't mean there won't be consequences for both of us. Across town, Eleanor Calder was far from defeated. Seated in a private booth at an exclusive cafe, she met with her closest ally, Victor Black, the enigmatic figure behind the financial dealings that had propped up the Calder fortune. "You should have handled that girl before she had a chance to speak," Victor said, his voice low and measured. He sipped his espresso, his piercing gaze fixed on Eleanor. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I underestimated her. She's more cunning than I gave her credit for." Victor leaned back, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "And now? What's your plan?" Eleanor's eyes burned with determination. "Adrian is weak. He'll try to cut ties with me to save face, but I'm not letting him walk away with everything. And as for Marta," her lips curled into a dangerous smile, "she'll regret the day she crossed me." Victor tilted his head, intrigued. "Careful, Eleanor. Desperation makes people sloppy." Eleanor's smile only widened. "Desperation also makes them dangerous." That evening, as Marta returned to her quarters, she found an unmarked envelope waiting for her on the small table near the door. Her name was written in elegant script, and the paper smelled faintly of jasmine. She hesitated before opening it, her pulse quickening. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a typed message. "You've made powerful enemies. Watch your back." There was no signature, no clue as to who had sent it, but Marta knew exactly where it had come from. Eleanor. Her hands trembled as she read the note again, anger and fear warring within her. She had expected retaliation, but the reality of it sent a chill down her spine. A soft knock at the door made her jump. Felix's voice called out, "Marta, it's me." She opened the door, the note still clutched in her hand. Felix's eyes immediately landed on it, his expression darkening as he read the words. "You need to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "Tonight." "What? I can't just run away," Marta protested. Felix grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm but not unkind. "This isn't just about you anymore. Eleanor's capable of anything. If you stay here, she'll find a way to bury you." Marta hesitated, her mind racing. She had spent years being invisible, playing it safe. But now, after everything, could she really run away and let Eleanor win? As night fell, Adrian received an unexpected visitor, Victor Black. The two men faced each other in the dimly lit library, the air between them tense. "What do you want, Victor?" Adrian asked, his voice sharp. Victor smiled faintly. "Just a friendly warning. Eleanor isn't going to go quietly." Adrian scoffed. "She's already out of moves." Victor's smile widened. "You underestimate her, and you underestimate me." Before Adrian could respond, Victor pulled a small folder from his briefcase and slid it across the desk. Adrian opened it, his face darkening as he read the contents. "This isn't possible," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, it's very possible," Victor replied, "and it's just the beginning." As Victor left the estate, Adrian sat alone in the library, his hands gripping the folder tightly. The contents inside had the power to destroy him and everything he had worked for. Meanwhile, Marta stood at her window, staring out at the estate grounds. Somewhere in the darkness, she knew Eleanor was plotting her next move. The war was far from over, and Marta had no intention of surrendering. The Calder estate buzzed with tension, a sharp contrast to its usual air of effortless luxury. Whispers of scandal and betrayal had turned the once glorious mansion into a fortress on the brink of collapse. Marta stood in her modest quarters, staring at the envelope she had received the previous evening. Eleanor's warning was clear. This was no longer about justice. This was a battle for survival. Felix entered without knocking, his expression grim. "They've called a board meeting. Eleanor's bringing Victor Black. Whatever's happening, it's going down tonight." Marta clenched her fists. "Then tonight is when we end this." Felix tilted his head, his lips curving into a half-smile. "You have a plan?" Marta reached for the leather-bound notebook on her desk. "Not a plan. Proof." The Calder boardroom was a picture of tension when Marta arrived. Adrian sat at the head of the table, his face pale but resolute. Eleanor was on his right, her icy composure a mask for the fury simmering beneath. Victor Black lounged nearby, his presence a silent reminder of the threat he posed. "Marta," Adrian said as she entered, his voice cautious. "Why are you here?" Marta set the notebook on the table with a resolute thud. "Because the truth deserves to be heard." Eleanor's eyes narrowed into slits. "This is a private meeting. You have no place here." Marta met Eleanor's gaze, her voice steady. "No place? After everything you've done, I'd say I've earned a seat at this table." Victor chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit doesn't win wars." "No," Marta said, her tone sharp. "But evidence does." She opened the notebook and began laying out its contents for the board. Account numbers, transaction records, even snippets of emails she had managed to photograph. Each piece was a nail in the coffin of Eleanor's schemes. The board members leaned in, their shock and anger growing with every page Marta revealed. Adrian's face darkened as the weight of the evidence settled over him. "This is outrageous," Eleanor hissed, her mask of composure slipping. "You're taking the word of a maid?" Marta's jaw tightened, but Adrian was the one who responded. "She's presenting facts, Eleanor, and it's more than I can say for you." Eleanor rose from her seat, her composure unraveling with every second. "Don't you see what's happening?" she cried, her voice rising. "She's trying to destroy us, Adrian. Everything